What happens if I turn around? What happens if I turn around? The Night Shift Rules by Silas Holloway. I met him at a roadside coffee shop off I-17, somewhere between Phoenix and Flagstaff. The place was forgettable. Fluorescent lights buzzing like tired insects, cracked vinyl seats, coffee bitter enough to wake the dead. He wore a faded uniform with no name tag and carried the smell of burnt grease and stale cigarette smoke, though he claimed he didn't smoke. His eyes were bloodshot in that way only night workers' eyes ever are, pupils adjusted to a world the sun never sees. He wouldn't give me the name of the diner where he worked. Somewhere in Arizona, he said, with a shrug that made it clear that even if I found it, I wouldn't like what I saw. I didn't press him. Some stores don't want to be found. He stirred his coffee without drinking it, eyes flicking to the window, like he half expected something to crawl across the glass. Then, after a long silence, he began to talk. I've been working the night shift at Mel's Diner for about 11 months. Took the job because it paid in cash and asked no questions. On my first night, taped under the counter next to the gum and spare pens, I found a sticky note folded in half. On the front, someone had written, "Follow these if you want to last." Inside were 4 handwritten rules. 1. If a customer asks to sit at booth 5, tell them it's reserved, even if the diner is empty. 2. Do not let anyone in at 3:33 a.m., no matter how much they beg. 3. If the jukebox plays by itself, unplug it. Don't listen. 4. Every Thursday, exactly 2:14 a.m., open the freezer and whisper, "Still here." Then close it. I laughed when I first read it. Clearly some bored teenager's idea of a prank, something to mess with the new guy. The rules seemed absurd, like something out of a bad horror movie, but the shifts were long, lonely, and mind-numbingly dull. I figured following a weird set of rules might at least keep my brain entertained during the dead hours between 2 and 5 a.m. when even the highway went quiet. That was before the rules started making sense. The first incident happened exactly 2 weeks after I started. The man who walked in looked ordinary enough at first glance, but something about him set my teeth on edge immediately. Maybe it was the way he moved. Too smooth, too deliberate, like he was concentrating on each step. Or maybe it was his eyes, which never seemed to focus on anything in particular. He sat down at the counter without a word and waited. I approached with the coffee pot, trying to place what was bothering me about him. "Coffee?" I asked. He nodded. That's when I realized what was wrong with his eyes. He didn't blink, not once. Just stared straight ahead at the menu board behind me with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every word. He sat there for nearly 40 minutes, occasionally lifting the mug to his lips but never actually seeming to drink. The coffee level never went down. And he never ever blinked. At exactly 2:40 a.m., he stood up abruptly and spoke for the first time since ordering. "I'd like to sit at booth 5. I glanced over at the booth in question. It was empty, clean, no reason at all to refuse the request. The rational part of my mind said there was no harm in letting him move from the counter to a booth. Rule number 1. "Sorry," I heard myself saying. "That booth is reserved." He nodded as if this made perfect sense, reached into his wallet, and placed the $20 bill on the counter next to his untouched coffee. Then he walked out without another word, the bell chiming softly behind him. I picked up the bill to put it in the register, and immediately knew something was wrong. The paper felt strange, too soft, like fabric instead of currency. When I looked closer, the president's face was distorted, features subtly wrong in ways that made my brain hurt to process. I left it on the counter, planning to ask Mel about it when he came in for the morning shift. But when the sun came up and the first rays of light hit the bill, it crumbled to ash right before my eyes. By the time Mel arrived at 8 a.m., there was nothing left but a small pile of gray dust that could have been anything. I didn't mention it to him. The second incident happened in mid-June. It was around 3:25 a.m. when the temperature inside the diner suddenly plummeted. In a span of maybe 30 seconds, the diner went from stifling desert heat to something that felt like the inside of a walk-in freezer. That's when the knocking started. Desperate, frantic pounding on the front door that made the whole building shake. Through the windows, which were now completely fogged over from the sudden temperature change, I could just barely make out a human silhouette. I grabbed a towel and wiped away some of the condensation from the nearest window. What I saw made my blood freeze colder than the suddenly Arctic air. It was a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, with long dark hair that hung in wet tangles around her face. She was barefoot, wearing what looked like a hospital gown that was torn and stained with something dark, but it was her face that really got to me. Pale as paper, eyes wide with terror and blood. So much blood. Every instinct I had screamed at me to unlock that door. I was already reaching for the deadbolt when I caught sight of the clock. 3:33 a.m. Rule 2. My hand froze halfway to the lock. She stopped pounding on the door and just stood there, staring at me through the fogged window. Then, at exactly 3:34 a.m., she turned and walked away into the desert darkness. I stood there for another 10 minutes, waiting for her to come back, listening for screams or sounds of struggle from outside. Nothing. Just the desert wind and the gradual return of the stifling heat as the diner's temperature normalized. The third incident involved the jukebox, and it was the one that finally convinced me the rules weren't a joke. It was a quiet Thursday night in August. I was catching up on some reading, a paperback novel I'd been working through during slow periods, when I heard it. Music. Except it wasn't really music. The jukebox in the corner had somehow turned itself on. But instead of one of the old country songs or classic rock hits that filled its catalog, what came out of the speakers was wrong. Static at first, like tuning between radio stations. Then a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into my bones. It wasn't a melody so much as a pattern, repetitive, hypnotic, ancient sounding. Like a chant in a language that predated human civilization. I found myself drawn to it despite every rational thought telling me to stay away. There was something mesmerizing about the sound, something that made me want to get closer and listen more carefully. My feet started moving toward the jukebox, without any conscious command from my brain. Rule 3. I forced myself to change direction, fighting against the strange, magnetic pull of that otherworldly humming. Every step toward the wall outlet felt like walking through molasses, but I managed to reach the plug and yank the cord free. The humming didn't stop immediately. It lingered like an echo, rattling the coffee pots, slithering through the vents. I covered my ears and whispered apologies to no one, until it finally stopped. I left the jukebox unplugged after that, but sometimes, during the quietest hours of my shift, I could swear I saw lights flickering inside its glass front, even with the power cord lying coiled on the floor. The fourth incident was my fault entirely. When 2:14 a.m. rolled around, I glanced at the freezer but didn't get up from my stool behind the counter. I was comfortable, halfway through a crossword puzzle, and the whole whisper into the freezer ritual seemed particularly absurd that night. What was the worst that could happen if I skipped it once? I found out 16 minutes later. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the freezer door exploded open with a bang that rattled every dish into place. Not a gentle swing or a slow creak, it slammed open, like someone had kicked it from the inside with tremendous force. And then I heard the breathing. Deep, wet, labored breaths coming from inside the freezer. I grabbed the biggest knife from the prep station and approached the freezer inch by terrified inch. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the knife twice. But I forced myself to keep moving forward. I reached the freezer and peered inside, half expecting to find some injured person who had somehow gotten trapped among the frozen food. Instead, inside was only meat, boxes, frozen pie crusts. Nothing alive. But when I looked closer, all the labels had changed. Instead of brands or dates, each package now had a name, a dozen names, maybe more, written on packages that definitely hadn't been labeled that way when I last checked the freezer inventory. Names I didn't recognize at first, and then I saw one that made my heart stop. Tommy Reeves. Tommy was the guy who had trained me during my first week, the previous night shift worker who had supposedly quit without notice, except according to Mel and the morning crew. No one named Tommy had ever worked at the diner. But I remembered Tommy clearly. We'd worked together for 3 nights before he'd stopped showing up. Now his name was on a package of ground beef in a freezer that was apparently breathing. I whispered, "Still here," into the freezer, my voice barely audible over the labored breathing sounds. The response was immediate. The breathing stopped. The freezer door swung shut with a gentle click, and the labels returned to normal. I never skipped the Thursday ritual again. The fifth encounter was with a regular customer, a trucker named Gil who always ordered black coffee and eggs, over easy. That night, Gil came in at his usual time, sat at his booth, except his skin was pale, his hands stiff like he couldn't bend his fingers. When he spoke, it sounded like words were being scraped off sandpaper. He ordered his usual, then asked if I remembered him. Of course I remembered him. Gil was one of my few regular customers, a friendly face in an otherwise lonely job. "Sure, Gil. You come in twice a week, usually order the same thing. How's the family?" Gil smiled, but it wasn't his usual warm grin. This was something colder, sadder. "I died last week," he said conversationally, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Rolled my rig up by Apache Wash on Tuesday morning. They pulled my body out of the cab 2 days ago." I dropped the coffee pot I'd been holding. It shattered on the floor, sending glass and hot coffee across the tiles, but I barely noticed. Gil didn't react to the crash at all. He just kept smiling that cold, sad smile and lifted his cup to his lips again. "Funeral's tomorrow," he continued. I stood there frozen, watching as Gil became gradually more transparent. It started with his hands, which faded until I could see the table through them, then spread up his arms and across his torso. Within minutes he was barely visible, just an outline of the man I'd known. "Take care of yourself, kid," he said, his voice now coming from very far away. Then he was gone entirely. I called the trucking company the next morning after my shift ended. The dispatcher confirmed what Gil had told me. Gilberto Martinez, one of their most experienced drivers, had been killed in a single vehicle accident on a rainy Tuesday morning. The funeral was that afternoon. The sixth and final incident was with the phone. It rang at 2:06 a.m. This was unusual for several reasons. First, nobody ever called the diner during my shift. The phone was technically connected, but it was an old rotary model that mostly served as decoration. But it was ringing, loud and insistent, cutting through the desert silence like a fire alarm. "Nell's Diner," I said. Silence on the other end. Then, in a voice I didn't recognize, someone spoke my full name. Not just my first name, which was on my name tag, but my complete legal name, including my middle initial that I never used. My blood went cold. "Who is this?" I managed to ask. "Don't turn around," the voice replied, ignoring my question entirely. Every muscle in my body locked up. I was standing behind the counter, facing the front windows, my back to the rest of the diner. The sudden command not to turn around made me desperately want to do exactly that. But something in the voice's tone kept me frozen in place. "You're wearing your blue work shirt," the voice continued, "the one with the small bleach stain near the left pocket. Your apron has coffee stains and a small tear where you caught it on the grill last week. There are 7 buttons on your shirt, but the third one from the top is loose and will fall off soon." I looked down at myself. Every detail the voice described was accurate, down to the loose button I'd been meaning to fix for days. "How did you—" "He's behind you," the voice interrupted. The temperature in the diner dropped to 20 degrees in an instant. I could feel a presence behind me, something large, impatient, and cold. My breath started fogging, and frost began forming on the windows. "What happens if I turn around?" The silence stretched for so long I thought the connection had been lost. "Then, you already know the answer to that." "What should I do?" I whispered. "Finish your shift. Don't turn around until the sun comes up." The line went dead. I stood there for the remaining 4 hours of my shift, facing the front windows, watching the darkness outside gradually lighten to gray and into gold. I never turned around. I never looked at any reflective surfaces. I just stood there, counting my heartbeats and watching the sun rise over the desert. When he finished the story, I realized I hadn't touched my coffee. He looked up, smiled in that tired way people do when they've lived with the same nightmare long enough that it no longer feels like one. I asked him why he still worked there. Didn't he care about his life? About what might happen if he slipped up? He shrugged. Said you get used to it. Said the rules are easy to follow, and it's not so bad once you learn to stop asking questions. Said there's even talk of a promotion soon, maybe a manager position. He stood up and stretched, cracked his knuckles, and said it was time to head back. The diner needed him. As he walked toward the door, I watched the light hit his face differently for just a moment. His eyes, just for a second, turned completely black. And then he was gone. I sat there for a long while after that, wondering if I should try to find that diner. I won't. I know I won't. Some places don't want to be found. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. And some rules exist for a reason, even if no one remembers who wrote them. If this sort of thing keeps you up at night, you might want to subscribe. There's always more buried in the archives. And if there's a story you're looking for, drop it in the comments. Odds are, I've already got a file with your name on it, just haven't dusted it off yet.